My book is divided into 8 chapters. Each is a profile of a different country and looks at the various crises that Europe is facing through the prisms of these individual countries. And so I thought I would give you a sort of tour de horizon of the continent, and also how the election of Donald Trump plays a role, which I did not foresee when writing this book, but I do, like most people, but I do think it strengthens the arguments and the importance of this book. I think we had 3 assumptions, you could say, about Europe beginning in around 1989. The 3 assumptions were that Europe would be a place of perpetual peace, it would be a security exporter. You saw this in the discussions of NATO being, well, before Donald Trump called it obsolete, people said NATO was going to have to go out of area or out of business because Russia was no longer a threat. And so you saw interventions in the Balkans, you saw the intervention in Libya, in Afghanistan, and no one really thought that there would ever be a security crisis on the European continent again. The second consensus that we had was that liberal democracy would be sort of the form of government that everyone would agree upon in this part of the world, the Francis Fukuyama end of history thesis, if you will. And the third, it was an economic consensus around regulated free market capitalism, and that this would provide ever-increasing returns on investment. And you saw this in sort of the rise of the kind of the center-left, third way, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, Tony Blair in Britain, this sort of reconciling of the left to capitalism. And I think all 3 of these assumptions have been challenged and are being challenged now in Europe, and in some cases have been actually overturned. To start with security, I think clearly the biggest security threat that we see now in Europe comes from Russia. And the most important thing to understand about Russia is that it is a revisionist power. It is a historically revisionist power. It does not like the post-Cold War settlement, and it wants to revise it. It wants to actively change it, overturn it. And we see this most clearly, obviously, in Ukraine, where in Crimea, this was the first armed seizure of territory on the European continent since World War II. And not only that, the predicate for this, the reasons that were offered for this, were the same exact ones that were given for Adolf Hitler's conquests of the Sudetenland and Poland, and his own imperial conquest in Europe, which is basically inventing claims of ethnic oppression, and therefore my country needs to go in and save our ethnic brethren and take over this entire territory and annex it to our own. And that is exactly what Putin did in Crimea. And the reason why this matters, not just because of the Crimeans who are now part of Russia against their will, it matters because in some European countries which are NATO members, like the Baltic states, primarily Estonia and Latvia, about 25% or more of the populations of those countries are Russian speakers. And so while the conditions right now are not like what they were in Crimea in terms of the tensions between the Russian speakers and the non-Russian speakers, there really wasn't an ethnic conflict in eastern Ukraine either. It was invented by the Russians and their propaganda instruments. And so this understandably has the Baltic states very worried that the same sort of reasoning or rationale could be created for Russian adventurism in their own countries. I think the possibilities of this are slim, but they're big enough to be worried, that we should worry about it. I think that the Russians' ideal outcome, what they are trying to achieve with all their meddling in Western European politics, is the Finlandization of the West. This is a term from the Cold War, you may recall, where Finland was a neutral country, and they basically the term Finlandization is applied to countries that basically they allow another big country that's their neighbor basically dictate their foreign policy, and that's what the Finns did. There's a whole controversy about whether or not it was the right step for them to take. They were obviously in a very difficult position, sharing a 1,000-mile long border with Russia, but this is what the Russians want us to do in America and in Europe. They want to Finlandize the West, by which I mean they want us to basically abandon our principles, our values, our allies, what we stand for, and to accommodate Russian foreign policy prerogatives in their neighborhood. And they want to do this without dispatching a single soldier abroad. This isn't like the Cold War, when there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Warsaw Pact, and there was a real threat of an actual Soviet incursion into Western Europe. They want to do this by basically turning us against ourselves, by bringing to power leaders in Western countries who will allow the Kremlin, allow the Russians to basically get away with what they want. And so that's clearly why they supported Marine Le Pen in this country. I think that's why they supported Donald Trump in my country. That's why they are supporting all manner of fringe political figures on the right and left. It doesn't really matter. This isn't, again, not like the Cold War where there was an ideology of Marxist-Leninism. They don't care if you're on the far right, as long as you basically agree to this sort of Yalta II settlement that the Russians want. Then you will see Russian puppetry behind the scenes. I think one of the most interesting examples of this is the founder of a movement in America to get the state of California to secede from the United States, which sounds like a totally crazy idea, and it is, and it's probably never going to happen. The founder of this organization lives in Russia. He's an American who lives in Russia. And you might say, why are the Russians supporting this cockamamie scheme? It's never going to happen. You need to understand the way they look at this is, why not? Why not throw a couple rubles? It can't be that much on these disruptive political forces. And you see that everywhere in Europe. Fringe figures in journalism, intellectuals, political movements, they all sort of cohere around this sort of Russian view of the world that's anti-liberal, that's anti-American, it's anti-NATO, it's anti-West, basically. And there's a return address, which is often in Moscow. As an example of this, I think the most successful example of this was Brexit, which obviously there's a long history of opposition to the European Union in Britain, and I'm not claiming that had the Russians not advocated for it through their propaganda instruments that it wouldn't have happened. But clearly there was a Russian hand in this. If you watched RT or read Sputnik, the main propaganda instruments of the Russian government, which I was very delighted to see the president of this country confront President Putin on yesterday and calling them what they are, which are propaganda instruments. They were very pro-Brexit, and I think Brexit is a real tragedy for Europe, but also for the British. I think there hasn't been a major economic impact yet, because it hasn't happened, but I think there will be. And you're already starting to see the investment climate in Britain is not very good, because there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. I think internally the political dynamics of the EU will be very negatively affected by Britain leaving. Britain has been a real voice for market liberalism and the expansion into Eastern Europe, and now we're going to lose that voice. And the EU will be more of a Franco-German project. And the consequence of this is that those countries in Europe, which adhere to a more Anglo-Saxon market view of the world, are going to feel isolated and left out. And I think that voices for leaving the EU in places like the Netherlands or even Denmark will increase as the EU becomes more of a Franco-German dominated project. I also think the chances of Scotland leaving the EU, not in the near term, but certainly over the longer term, have increased. You have to remember that the Scots are very pro-European Union. One of the reasons that they voted against independence in 2014 was because they didn't want to become an independent country outside of the EU. That was one of the main reasons that the pro-UK side gave to Scots not to leave the United Kingdom. And now the Scots are being taken out of the European Union against their will. And so the case for Scottish independence will increase. I also think you could potentially see the return of sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland, where a key provision of the peace that we've had in Northern Ireland for the past 20 years was that there's no border between Ulster Province in the north and the Republic of Ireland. And also that Northern Ireland Irish citizens can also be Irish citizens. And now that Britain is leaving the EU, you might see the erection of a hard border again between Ulster and the rest of Ireland. And I fear that this could create the conditions for the return of sectarian conflict, which it hasn't existed really for the past 20 years in that part of the country. Grant alluded earlier to the success of Emmanuel Macron, which obviously many people welcomed. You can tell by the title of my book, I tend to look at the world through the glass half empty. So I'll give you the pessimist take on this, which is that in the first round of the election, if you added up the support that not only Marine Le Pen got, but that Jean-Luc Mélenchon also received, and these two candidates are very, very, very similar. I mean, on their economic programs are basically the same. Their foreign policies are basically the same: pro-Russian, anti-American, anti-NATO. If you add up these two, the support that they both got, plus the smattering of other, even extreme further left candidates, you almost have half the country of France voting for some form of political extremism, or at least on the issue of the economy, which I think is really the most important issue in France, where you've had persistently high unemployment for decades, and I think is one of the main contributing factors to the Islamism problem here, because the unemployment rate among foreign-born or foreign-descended French is even higher than it is for native, and it's incredibly high among Islamic youth. I think it's like 40% or something. This country needs major economic reforms. It needs to liberalize its labor markets. And I think if you look at the election results, at least the first round, there's going to be a lot of hesitance to that in this country against implementing them. And of course, a lot will depend upon the election results in a couple of weeks for the National Assembly. But I think that Mr. Macron has a very difficult path ahead of him, and I obviously wish him well. The other interesting thing to note, I think, about the election results here is the collapse of political parties. No one would have thought that you would have had an independent political movement starting out of nowhere in a country like France, where the two main parties have been so dominant and strong for decades. And also, we've seen in tandem with that a rise of, well, the collapse of the political center and the rise of political extremes. So you have Mélenchon, you have Marine Le Pen, you have the collapse of the French Socialist Party, and this has been remarkable to see this across the European continent, is the collapse of social democracy, which for those of us who really admire the European model, where you've had very impressive political stability alternating between Christian Democrats and social Democrats, to see the collapse of social democracy across the continent is a very worrying sign. In Britain, you have the Labour Party completely hollowed out and taken over by a Trotskyite cabal. There's really no other way to describe it. In Greece, you have the collapse of the Social Democratic Party, PASOK, in that country, and it's been overtaken by Syriza. In Spain, the Social Democrats have lost a lot of their support to Podemos, which is a sort of Latin American-style Chavez, illiberal, authoritarian movement. In Austria, I can go on and on. I mean, in Austria, the presidential election was between the far-right Freedom Party and the Greens. The Five Star Movement in Italy is the most popular party in that country, which also, to go back to my original point, has some shady connections to Moscow. There's a piece in the New York Times today that I encourage you all to read about this very subject. And even in Germany, which is the most sort of politically stable, boring country in Europe, thank God, the combined support of the CDU and the SPD has been decreasing over the past several years. And a lot of that has to do with the rise of the far right, with the Alternative for Deutschland, which started as a party of anti-Euro, kind of egghead academic types, but in recent years has basically transformed itself into a blood and soil, National Front type ethnic identity party, and is very ugly in that sense. They will become, this upcoming Bundestag election in the fall will be the first time in the history of post-war Germany that a far-right party enters the Bundestag. And so this is a very sort of sober moment, I think, in post-war German politics. They're obviously not going to get as much support as we initially feared about a year ago, where they were polling at 15 to 20%, but they're going to enter the Bundestag, and that will change German politics. On the question of liberal democratic consensus, this has been most challenged, most assertively challenged in Hungary, which has really been off the radar for most people for years, until recently, because the Hungarian government has been trying now to shut down the Central European University, which was founded by George Soros. It is really the academic jewel of Central and Eastern Europe. And because of this, because it is sort of a center of critical independent thinking, liberal in the classical sense of the word, the Hungarian government has been trying to shut it down through some, cockamamie legislative process that's completely without basis. I remember covering, so this all began, and you could say in 2010, when Viktor Orban was the prime minister. He returned to power and immediately went about basically turning the country into a one-party state. And he gave a speech in 2014 where he literally said, we want to turn Hungary into an illiberal democracy. And he cited Turkey, China, and Russia as models. And this shocked a lot of people at the time for obvious reasons, but I had been following Hungary since 2010. I was working at Radio Free Europe, I traveled there, and really from the very beginning of coming into power, it was evident the direction that Hungary was going in. There were constitutional changes, there were attacks on the judiciary, on the media, basically on all sort of independent checks and balances. And at the time, we all kind of looked at this as being some sort of provincial, weird thing going on in Eastern Europe, in this country where no one speaks the language, and we don't know much about it. But now, 7 years later in 2017, you realize that Viktor Orban was really onto something. After Brexit, after Trump, Viktor Orban doesn't look so, how to put it, he doesn't look so extreme anymore. He looks like he really kind of put his finger to the wind and saw which way it was blowing, and was anticipating a lot of these illiberal changes that have been going on in the Western world, and he kind of got on that train before anyone else did. And he has really emerged, I think, within sort of the center-right in Europe. He's actually emerged as this sort of strongest, he's on sort of the other pole of Merkel. If you see Merkel as being the kind of liberal conservative part of the spectrum, you have Orban being the sort of authoritarian illiberal part of the right-wing spectrum. And sadly, he has a lot of support within the center-right on this continent, particularly for his stance on the migration crisis. And so if there's going to be any real positive change in Hungary, I don't think it's going to be coming through the institutional level, through the EU. I think it'll be very difficult to punish Hungary, because when the EU was created, no one really thought there would ever be a scenario where you would actually have to kick a member out. That just was not something that was ever considered. And so there really are not, and they tried it, if you recall, with Austria in 2000 when Jörg Haider, the far-right leader, entered into government. And it was very unsuccessful what they did. They basically had a kind of cordon sanitaire where EU officials and European leaders wouldn't meet with Austrian officials. And they tried it for a couple of months and it didn't work. So I think if there's going to be any positive change in Hungary, it's going to have to come from the center-right in Europe, by which I mean the political family, the European People's Party, of which the Republicans in this country are members of, the Christian Democrats, the Partido Popular in Spain. It is the responsibility of the center-right in Europe to basically tell Orban that what he's doing is wrong. Because if they don't do that, then the fear is that Orbanism, if you will, could spread. And I think we're already seeing this in this part of Europe, in the Visegrad Four, which is Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. You're seeing this creeping authoritarianism spread. In Poland, there is a right-wing nationalist government whose leader has openly called for Budapest in Warsaw. So he basically wants to emulate what Orban is doing in Hungary in Poland, and they're causing lots of problems within the EU. In the Czech Republic, we see a potential kind of mini-Trump-like oligarchic figure who might become the next prime minister of that country. And in Slovakia, there's a strange situation where there's a social democratic prime minister who's sort of a social democrat in name only, but who is also very illiberal in his own right. And so this is very sad for those of us who put a lot of hope in this part of the world, who saw New Europe as being the kind of inspiration, sort of reminding, after 1989, we brought these countries into the European Union. They inspired a lot of us on the other side of the Atlantic with their struggle against the Soviet Union. To see them moving in this direction is very worrisome. Germany is obviously the linchpin of all of this, and the chapter on Germany is about the potential return of strategic neutrality, and basically Germany's role in the world. Does Germany see itself as being an anchor of the Western alliance, or does it want to be a neutral power, basically straddling the middle between the West and Russia? And you have to understand there's a very strong yearning in Germany for neutrality, to not take sides. This goes back to before the post-war period, when obviously a lot of Germans didn't want to join NATO. They didn't want to be a part of the Western alliance against the Soviet Union. You had many Germans who wanted to basically accept Joseph Stalin's offer of reunification with neutrality. And I see the return of these sentiments. And I think that the election of Donald Trump could potentially exacerbate this, because it will now be very easy for those voices in Germany who favor this approach, who want a neutral Germany, to basically point the finger at Washington and say, well, look at what we have in the United States. Is it really that much worse than Vladimir Putin in Russia? And we've seen this now. This is actually being used now in the German election campaign. There was this speech given yesterday by the leader of the Social Democrats, who's running against Chancellor Merkel, where he launched this really heated attack on Trump, basically defending Merkel's honor as the symbol of the German people, and how dare this man treat her in such fashion. And so it's very worrisome to see anti-Americanism, and it's hard to call it anti-Americanism because it's clearly directed at Trump the person. But still, the kind of distancing from the United States this is becoming a campaign theme in Germany. The migration crisis is over for now, although I don't think it is gone forever. I think if you look at the European periphery, Europe is in a very dangerous neighborhood, an unstable neighborhood. If you look at North Africa and the Middle East, there's enormous potential that we could see a repeat of what we saw in 2015 with over 1 million people entering Europe in that period of time. One country to look out for is Algeria, where the leader is apparently on his deathbed, and there isn't a clear secession pattern, and there's a huge Islamist issue in that country. So I think this is something that Europeans need to be wary of. And the effect that the migration crisis had on politics in Europe, I think is the main factor why you saw and have seen the rise of the far right and also this illiberal trend. And there's an interesting connection to Russia here, which is that obviously the main source of migrants, about half of them, came from Syria. And the vast majority of them were fleeing the regime of Bashar al-Assad. They're not fleeing ISIS. They're fleeing the barrel bombs of the Assad regime, which is supported by the Russians. So you can see Russia actively intervening in a conflict in Syria, basically driving out hundreds of thousands of people from this country. They go to Europe, and what do they do in Europe? Their presence in Europe encourages and inspires and gives credence to the arguments of the far right, who are in turn, in many cases, sponsored by the Russians. So you have this kind of vicious circle where the Russians are supporting instability in the European periphery, driving huge migrant flows of Muslims, mostly Muslim men, into Europe, where they have difficulties assimilating, where they're exacerbating the pre-existent problems that you already have in Europe between I don't want to call them the native population, but the majority population in the Muslim minority, and it's exacerbating those problems, which is in turn leading to the rise of illiberal populism. So what is Trump's role in this? Well, I think that for the first time in American history, we have a president who, if not, at best, he's apathetic to Europe, about Europe. At worst, he's actively hostile to it. I think this is the consequences of having a foreign policy that is completely uninformed by values and that is purely informed by transactionalism. Donald Trump does not understand why a country like Germany and why a leader like Angela Merkel is an ally of the United States and a friend of the United States, and why a country like Russia and a leader like Vladimir Putin is an adversary. He's not capable of comprehending the difference between allies and adversaries. This is very problematic, to say the least. I don't think there was a leader whom he attacked more by name during the presidential election campaign than Angela Merkel. Meanwhile, there was no leader who he had more nice things to say about than Vladimir Putin. The meeting last week in Brussels was an obvious disaster. There was a lot of anticipation that he would endorse formally the Article 5 clause of the Atlantic Charter, which is the NATO treaty, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. He failed to do that. This has created a great deal of ambiguity vis-a-vis Russia. People seem to forget that the reason why we didn't have World War III on this continent during the Cold War was because the Russians believed NATO, and they believed in NATO, and they believed that the United States would come to the defense of its allies. That if they ever crossed the Fulda Gap, if you remember that sort of part of Cold War history, that if they ever did try to cross the Fulda Gap, then they would be met with a response. And now we have a president who is creating this sense of ambiguity about America's security commitment to its allies, who seems to see NATO as a piggy bank, purely as a piggy bank, and not as something that is actually in the interest of the United States, that it is a force multiplier for the United States, that we are able to actually have more influence and more power in the world because of our alliances. They make America stronger, and that America is actually blessed. I think there's no power in world history that has had more allies than the United States, and this is what basically keeps the world relatively peaceful, is that the United States has so many allies around the world with whom we can work to keep the sea lanes open, with whom we can contain aggressive predatory powers like the Russians or the Iranians, or even Venezuela, for instance. Donald Trump does not seem to see this. He sees alliances as basically being a drain on the United States and a ripoff and a scam. So what I mean by just in conclusion, what I mean by the title of my book, The End of Europe, it doesn't mean necessarily the dissolution of the European Union, although that is a possibility, but rather the reversion to something approximating the pre-integrationist model of Europe, where we have an assortment of small, maximally sovereign, often squabbling nation-states that are weaker individually than they are when they're united, and that most importantly no longer stand for the values, the liberal values that unite the transatlantic community, and that are all basically seeking out their own modus vivendi with the Russians. It would be the end of Europe as we know it, which is a place of peace, prosperity, democracy, social harmony, and liberal values, or at least that's the Europe as we've known it for the past 70 years. It could be a continent of little Trumps and Berlusconis and Orbans and Le Pens. And so on that optimistic note, I will conclude and take some questions. Thank you. So, who's first? I often hear this question asked, and it's usually asked in Western Europe or America. And because I spend so much time living in the Czech Republic and traveling through that part of the world, I know too many Poles and Baltic peoples and Slovaks and Hungarians who lived under Soviet oppression that it's really not my place to say that, or to even sympathize with this. I know you're not saying that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a bad thing. No. But you often hear this argument that, well, we shouldn't have expanded NATO and we humiliated the Russians. Well, the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was because it was an empire ruled by brute force and occupation and slavery. So it should have collapsed. And the problem is that we generally agree with this in the West, whereas Russia is now ruled by a man who has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And it pains me to say this, but I really believe that Russia has a problem. And it has to do with history. And they haven't confronted their history, honestly. If you look at a country like Germany, which there's so much to admire in the way the Germans have confronted their past. I think they've done it better than anyone else in the world. I think we as Americans could learn how to talk more about things like slavery and the way we treated Native Americans. We could learn something from the Germans. You go to Berlin and you cannot escape what that country did. It's on the cobblestones that they put outside homes that belong to Jews. It's the massive Holocaust memorial right in the center of Berlin. It's the fact that every German school child is taught this from a very early age, and most of them visit concentration camps as part of their education. And because of this, no one fears Germany anymore. In fact, you could even say that we want Germany to be more assertive. We want them to spend more on their defense. If you go to Poland or the Baltic states today, they want German soldiers on their territory to defend them from Russia. Now, look at Russia. Is there a single country that borders Russia that doesn't live in abject fear of Russia? No. They're all terrified of Russia. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that whereas in Germany, Hitler is acknowledged as the monster that he was, in Russia, Joseph Stalin is being venerated as a hero. And so when the Russians come to terms with their own past, honestly, in the way that the Germans did, I don't think that we'll have these problems with Russia anymore. But because they see the Soviet Union as being this great thing, and the highlight and the heights of their civilizational existence, they have this imperial nostalgia. And so it's really for them to get over. It's not for us to get over. Now, look, could we have done a better job in the 90s of transitioning Russia to a market liberal economy? Absolutely. I mean, we totally screwed that up. Because most Russians today, they associate democracy. When they hear that word, they think of the 1990s, which was a very chaotic period. You had the rise of the oligarchs who were stripping all the public assets, getting filthy rich, while the average Russian was actually doing worse, probably, than he was in the 80s. And so Vladimir Putin was able to come into power and basically make a deal with the Russian people and said, you know, forget this democracy crap. I'm going to make you rich. I'm going to improve your economic situation. You know, don't protest me. And most Russians were cool with that. And that's why, I hate to say it, Vladimir Putin is a genuinely popular leader. I don't believe these polls that say, you know, 85% of Russians support him, primarily because I would never trust a poll in Russia, because you can just imagine you're sitting at home and some random person calls you up on the phone and says, do you support the president? I mean, clearly you can't trust those numbers. But, I mean, the figure is probably around 60 to 65%. Vladimir Putin doesn't need to rig elections to win. He doesn't need to do that. He's a genuinely popular person. And so I think we're going to be stuck with him in some form of Putinism for quite a while.
Thank you.
Yes? I should have mentioned Georgia. You're absolutely right. And not only because what the Russians did there, but the response to it. There was no punishment for what the Russians did in Georgia. In fact, they were rewarded for it. I mean, the first diplomatic initiative that the Obama administration took when it came to power in 2009 was the reset policy, which was basically us, you know, ignoring what the Russians did in Georgia and say, hey, you know what, we want to get along with you guys. We're going to do this, you know, the New START treaty. We're going to take out the missile defense systems that we had put in Poland and the Czech Republic, and not only that, but we're going to announce it to the Poles on the anniversary of the day that they were invaded by the Soviet Union. You basically had the Obama administration, you know, ignoring the concerns of our allies in Central and Eastern Europe to make nice with the Russians. And I think we all know how that turned out. So you're absolutely right to bring up Georgia. Am I as pessimistic? It depends on the situation. I mean, I didn't talk about the France chapter in my talk today, which is about, it's called France Without Jews. And I mean, and this is the topic that I'm most pessimistic about, is the anti-Semitism problem and the exodus of Jews from Europe, in particular from France. I mean, there's this great quote that Manuel Valls gave in 2015, right after the Charlie Hebdo hyper-caché attacks, where, being a son of Spanish immigrants, he said, if 100,000 French people of Spanish descent like me were to leave France, I would never say that France is no longer France. But if 100,000 Jews left France, then the Republic would cease to be. And I agree with that sentiment. And if you actually take him by his word and you look at the numbers, I mean, if you extrapolate the number of Jews leaving just in the past 2 years, then, you know, in the next 12 years, by Mr. Valls' own definition, France will no longer be France. And this is a question I'm asked all the time. Well, you know, what is it like for the Jews in France? And I never have a really nice answer to that question. Perhaps, but we have a series of anti-Semitic murders in this country, and even those, my friend Mark Weitzman, who's a journalist here, who's been covering this story of Sarah Halimi, who was a Jewish woman apparently killed because she was Jewish in an anti-Semitic murder, and the media is not covering that aspect of it. They're completely ignoring it and treating it like it's just a break-in. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a French Jew. I can't say what the situation is like, but what I hear is not very heartwarming, I guess to say. It's a tough problem. Yes. Yeah, this is a really interesting kind of new geopolitical situation we're in, right? Because it was always, when continental Europe was going to pieces, it was the Anglo-American alliance that was there and that swept in and saved the day. And during the Cold War, when France had the Communist Party in coalition, in government, or you had hundreds of thousands of Germans on the streets protesting the deployment of nuclear-tipped Pershing missiles, it was always, you could depend upon the United Kingdom and the United States to really hold the line against the Soviets. And now we're in this situation where these two countries are basically drifting inward. And so it presents us with a new kind of geopolitical problem that we haven't had before. I guess the advice I would give to the Germans and the French is, vis-a-vis Trump, you can tell I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not America, and America is not Donald Trump. Just because this man was elected president, by the way, he lost the popular vote. I know he denies that to this day, but he lost the popular vote. Does not necessarily mean that, this is the end of America or that the free world is over. It's a very troubling thing that happened, the fact that this could happen, and it's very worrisome, and we as Americans need to, figure out why it happened so that it doesn't happen again. But I think that there's been a bit of a rush over the past couple of months, and in particular over the past couple of days in reaction to these Merkel comments, which seem to have been taken out of context and sort of blown out of proportion. I don't think that it is the end just yet. And so I would say, look, just because Donald Trump is president does not mean that you don't have allies in the US Congress. It doesn't mean that, the defense secretary is clearly a man who could have served under Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio. There are institutions in the United States. There's a free press, there's a very active opposition. I've been using this line quite a lot because I think it's important. Donald Trump is not a fascist, he's a golfer. There is not some kind of grand ideological project here to turn America into the Third Reich. Which doesn't mean that he's not dangerous, and doesn't mean that he's not a threat, and doesn't mean that we need to keep our eyes open to stop him from doing some nasty bad things. But we need to respond to him more like what he is, which is like a Berlusconi. And that requires a different skill set and strategy set than dealing with a bona fide fascist. And so I think there's been a little bit of a kind of hysterical response to Trump. And I think Chancellor Merkel's actually taken the right course here. I don't think that she is... she could take the route that her social democratic challenger is taking and basically attack Trump and say, this is, he's this horrible, evil man, and how dare he do these things. I think she's being very realistic and very prudent in the course that she's taken so far. And so I think that we shouldn't go for kind of rash responses yet. Yeah. Yes, I don't think her comments, it is not mutually exclusive to have a strong, united, more independent Europe that isn't dependent upon the United States for its security. That is not mutually exclusive from having a good relationship with the United States. You can have a positive relationship with the United States and also say, hey guys, we need to do more on our own. We can't always depend on the United States for everything. And I think that that is the path that she's trying to take. I wish that she didn't have to be put into this position, but I think it's the reality. And I think the other thing I would say to temper this is I don't think Donald Trump was elected because of his foreign policy outlook. No, but I'm not making fun of him. I mean that I don't think most Americans were voting for him because they agreed with his attacks on NATO, or they agreed necessarily, or that they even agreed with his positions on Russia and his veneration of Putin. It's been very worrisome to see the party of Ronald Reagan, now at the point where something like, a majority of Republicans consider Russia to be an ally. That's really worrisome. and astounding, actually, when you think of it. But I don't think that's why he won. So I wouldn't read in too much into his election as necessarily being, well, the American people voted for this guy because he's an isolationist, because he attacks NATO. They voted for him because of the immigration issue, primarily. And they voted for him because there's a sort of dissatisfaction with political elites. To the extent that you can divine, reasons for why people voted for this, I think it's very irrational. But to the extent you can divine reasons for why he won, I don't think it had to do with his positions on foreign policy. This isn't like, George W. Bush winning re-election in 2004 on a very strong, that was a foreign policy election. That's why George W. Bush won in 2004, was because of the Iraq War, because of the response to 9/11, that's why he won. I don't think 2016 was a foreign policy election. So I don't think Europeans need to, it's not the end of NATO. It's not the end of the transatlantic alliance. That's not what Americans were voting for when they voted for Donald Trump. And I think a lot of us sort of foreign policy wonks, we want to see the election as we see it, okay? And so I, was criticizing Trump constantly because of his views on foreign policy, but most Americans, that's not why they vote. That's not what they're voting for. And so I would say, to try to reassure the European audiences, it's not, he wasn't elected because he's so anti-European. That's not why he won. Yes? Well, I didn't really get to the economic question. Look, Europe's economies have basically been, on the whole, the Eurozone has been relatively stagnant since 2008, and this is a real problem. There's been very low growth. And when you have a situation in this country where the youth unemployment is 25%, that can lead to outcomes like 46% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting for Marine Le Pen, which totally defies everything we think about young people. In Britain, you had 70% of young people voting against Brexit. It was the old people who voted for it. Yet here, it was actually a higher percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds voted for Le Pen than people over 70, which totally confounds everything we think about how age determines your political views. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that you have higher unemployment. And so you're more susceptible to a demagogue like Marine Le Pen, who tells you, fantastical things about how she's going to bring back jobs to this country by somehow getting out of the EU or in redenominating to the franc or something. So I think this is a huge problem that needs to be tackled. I think it mostly lies with the responsibility of national governments to solve. I think the reason why France has its high unemployment rate is because of problems and errors and decisions that have been taken by French governments. It's not Brussels bureaucrats. It's not the euro that can be blamed for these things. I think, this is unpopular in some quarters, but I think the main reason why Greece is in the straits it's in is because of the Greeks. It's because of the decisions that they've made, or the decisions that they haven't made. I think they would actually maybe be in a worse position if they weren't in the euro. So I think I call for more neoliberalism. And I know this is such a horrible word these days, but that's what I think governments need. I think European governments need to be more competitive. They need to encourage more entrepreneurialism. They need to make it so that the young, smart, digital folks aren't all going to Silicon Valley. Why is it so difficult to start a new business in this country? I think that's, if you fix that, then you can fix your economy. It's not going to come from the state. It's not going to, the French government is not going to be able to, to create a jobs program and employ everyone for the rest of their lives anymore. Yes? That's a good question. I think in the long term, absolutely. Because, Baruch Hashem, Trump will be gone in 4 years. Praise be God. But we don't know. But Brexit could last forever. I could see a scenario where they actually go through with Brexit and the consequences are so bad that the Brits wake up and realize, we got to get back into this thing. But that could be very difficult. Well, that actually matters less than the way in which this came about.
Okay, but I just want to focus on...
Again, this is... Right.
I just like to focus on the question of whether Ukraine is being held against the will of the people.
Well, it's very hard, like for the same reason it's hard to get accurate polling in a country like Russia. How are you going to accurately, look, they had a vote, a quote-unquote vote, where there were two options: join Russia or revert to an earlier arrangement with Ukraine where Crimea apparently had more autonomy. This vote was taken with men, Russian soldiers with guns, walking the streets. You had Crimean Tatars being disappeared in the middle of the night. I mean, this was not a fair and legitimate election. So, look, if Crimea wanted to become part of Russia, it could have, there are legal ways that this could have theoretically happened. But that didn't happen. What they did was an Anschluss. Okay, I mean, that's what it was. And so that the most fundamental law we have in international relations, which is you do not take another territory over by arms, was violated by the Russians.
Right.
And so
I agree with
yeah.
that.
So you're just asking, what do the Crimeans think right now?
Well, but what you said was that the Crimeans were being held against their will.
Right.
And my question is there really enough evidence to say that?
Well, look, obviously there are the Crimeans. There are obviously many Crimeans who wanted to.
We're talking about a majority.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so then maybe it's best not to say it.
Well, no, the territory was taken illegally against the will of the country that it belongs to, which is Ukraine. And I know many Ukrainians. I have Crimean Tatar friend who's now a citizen of Russia. He woke up one morning and he's now a citizen of Russia. Yeah.
And there were separatist parties in Crimea
Yes.
before the annexation,
Yes.
which were polling at 3%.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Right. There were separatist parties in Crimea that got 2 to 3% of the vote. This was not, joining Russia was not ever really a serious prospect until March of 2014, when the Russians basically had a fait accompli. Is there time? Are we ending at 8:30?
one more question.
One more question. Yes. Well, I don't see why we can't do both. I mean, we did that during the Cold War, right? I mean, there were, I'm not saying we should do this now, but there were definitely suitcases full of cash going to the Christian Democrats in Italy in the late 1940s to stop the communists from winning that election. So, if that has to happen, I'm not going to...
So the follow-up question is, when the election happens in Russia...
Oh, we should not be interfering in a Russian election. No, absolutely not.
That's covert actions.
Well, look, I don't work for the CIA. So I'm not here to, I'm not here to advise against any of this. But it's obviously going to be a mix of both. It's going to be a mix of both. What astounds me, though, is the fact that how much of what the Russians do is overt, and how much of it doesn't bother people. Why is there not a law in this country preventing donations from outside the country to political parties in France? Yeah. In the United States, we have, as you know, some of the most crazy campaign. There are no campaign finance laws. You can spend however much you want, basically, but you cannot have foreign money, and there are huge penalties to pay if you're involved with foreign money in a U.S. presidential campaign or any U.S. election. Why in France? Why in Europe? This is standard across the European Union. In Britain right now, there's a huge investigation going on into potential foreign money in the Brexit race. Why is there not an EU law that all members have to sign on to prevents foreign money in their elections? This is a very easy thing to do. And once you do it, it's very, obviously there's going to be secret stuff going on, but you can catch people if there's improper financial transactions going on. So I think that's a very easy first step to take. But secondarily, it bothers me that Marine Le Pen never hid the fact that she was pro-Russian. She took this loan, everyone knew it, she didn't make a secret of it, she went to Moscow weeks before the election, smiling with Putin. This didn't really seem to affect, she did this because she thought it would help her.
Yeah.
It didn't seem to affect, why are the French people not more up in arms about this? But I could say the same thing about my country. It was very clear what the Russians were doing in the United States. You didn't have to be a private investigator to see what was going on. This didn't seem to bother people. And so I think we need to actually go into some kind of new Cold War understanding of what we're dealing with. Because I think a lot of people don't understand Russia as an adversary. They think that Russia could potentially be a partner, or maybe not a friend, but we can work with them on certain things. We don't see Russia like we did during the Cold War. And I think we have to move back into that. We have to see them again as a Cold War style adversary, who was in fact even more difficult to combat because, like I said earlier, we knew what we were dealing with in the Cold War. It was a Marxist-Leninist ideology, and we knew who their friends and allies were. It was the Communist Party in France. There were fellow travelers. I mean, we knew what we were up against. Now it's this complete fog. It's the far right. It's the far left. It's the Five-Star Party in Italy. It's the Freedom Party in Austria. It's elements of the Labour Party in Britain. It's more confusing. It's harder to make the case to people what it is we're up against. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll buy the book.